The glass clicked against the microphone once, twice, and then my father smiled like a pastor about to bless the room. "She's my greatest disappointment," he said into the mic at his 40th wedding anniversary, and the laughter that followed wasn't cruel, just relieved. People prefer a joke to a truth. Eyes slid to me 100 tiny verdicts. Someone squeezed my shoulder with pity I hadn't asked for. Then the chandeliers shivered as the air changed. Out beyond the country club's French doors, rotors carved the night. A Navy helicopter dropped low over the lawn, silverware rattling table runners, lifting like white flags. The band stopped. The photographer forgot to breathe. And when the doors flew open, a SEAL captain stepped through the gust and found me. "Admiral," he said, voice steady over the chop of blades, "the president needs you. Now." I didn't stand immediately. I let the words land, let them echo off the framed photos on the far wall wedding day. 2 kids' Christmases stacked like medals. Dad's smile flatlined. Mom's hand found his sleeve, a reflex older than this room. Someone at table 7 whispered, "Admiral," like the word had wandered into the wrong story. The captain didn't look at anyone else. He held my eyes like a compass, the kind made for storms. I rose. "If you're expecting triumph, you've never bled for it." There was no swell of music, no cinematic turn, just the thud of my own heartbeat and the taste of lemon icing from a cake I hadn't cut yet. I placed my napkin on the table, smoothed the crease, and heard Dad's breath catch through the mic he'd forgotten to set down. For a half second, the feedback sounded like a small animal in pain. Then silence. "I'll need 2 minutes," I told the captain. "You've got one," he said. "Then I'll take one," I replied, not unkind. I crossed the dance floor. My heels clicked over parquet Dad had insisted on renting because Oak says we made it. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at the champagne flute in his hand, suddenly fascinated by bubbles. I stopped beside him and turned the mic away from his mouth. "You're still on," I said softly. He flinched and cut the sound. Without the amplification, his voice sounded smaller. "You planned this," he said. Mom breathed a warning and a plea. The lawn beyond the doors glowed an impossible green under the helicopter's wash. White napkins flapped like gulls. I could feel the slipstream on my face, cool and clean, the kind of wind that scrubs you down to what matters. People parted as I moved, not out of reverence, just uncertainty, the oldest American reflex when in doubt makes space. On the patio, the captain stepped to my left. "Ma'am," he said, offering a headset. He kept his sentences tight, mission, brief, tight. A hijacked signal in the Atlantic. A ship that shouldn't be where it was. A cascade of blinking red lights in a place none of us could afford darkness. "Why me?" someone murmured behind me. Maybe Aunt Carol, maybe the kid who'd been running figure 8s around the dessert bar. I didn't turn. The answer wasn't for them. It wasn't even for me. It had been answered years ago in sand and salt and rooms with no windows. I'd worn a navy blue dress tonight, the kind chosen to offend no one, and reveal nothing. The captain glanced at my shoes, then back at the helicopter. "We've got boots on board," he said, the ghost of a smile acknowledging the practical absurdity of anniversaries collapsing into operations. "Give me 10 seconds, I said. He nodded and stepped away to radio the crew. I went back inside for my purse, and because old ghosts live in doorways. Dad met me there. Finally, eyes narrow, jaw set in that practiced clench that had framed my childhood. "You made this about you," he said, not quite whispering, not quite brave enough to be loud. "Dad?" Mom tried again, softer now, like a handkerchief. I looked at the gold band on his finger, the one he'd worn for 40 years, the one that could have been a compass if he'd let it. "I didn't call the helicopter," I said. "I didn't write your joke." He flushed. Pride and shame ride the same blood. "I'll be back if I can," I told Mom and kissed her cheek. Up close, I could smell her perfume, something lilac and old-fashioned, a scent that insists on gentleness. She squeezed my hand with a strength that surprised us both. I left the mic on the table and the pity on the floor. The captain and I jogged across lawn that had been manicured into submission. The crew chief reached down, grabbed my forearm, and hauled me into the belly of the bird like we'd practiced it. Because we had in other places, under other chandeliers, the fluorescent kind that buzz. As the doors slid shut and the world became noise and harness and clipped words, I let my head touch the cool metal for a single beat. Not to pray, to mark time. We lifted. The country club dropped away. Gazebo string lights the pond with the polite fountain. Somewhere down there, a DJ was still getting paid. Through the headset, the captain ran the outline again. Signal anomaly escalated to breach. Asset in transit without authorization. We're rendezvousing with a C-37 to DC. Then you brief in the sit room. POTUS is standing by. Standing, I asked. A smile I didn't see, only heard. So they said, who else is on? NSA. SecDef. A couple of the usual suspects who pretend they don't need you until they do. Copy, I said, and settled in. There's a thing that happens when you leave a room where people think they know you and go to a room where what you know matters more than who you are. Your breath evens. Your bones remember. The rotor turns your doubts into dust. Below us, the town unwound, the high school stadium, the church with its pale steeple, the diner where I had learned to drink coffee black and wish small. My phone buzzed in my purse. I didn't look. There are messages you can predict without reading. Come back. You ruined it. How dare you? Or worse, nothing. The captain tapped his tablet and angled it so I could read. Top-line data crawled like ants. Ship name. Coordinates. A line of code that didn't belong to any legal flag. Somewhere a screen would be watching my face to see if I blinked. I didn't. Any casualties yet? I asked. Negative. Yet. We both let the word sit. You from Coronado, I said, not for chit-chat, for calibration. You learn a person's edges fast if you know their water. BUDS 287, he said. Ran cold water before they made it safer. Everything's safer when it's colder, I said. He understood. The corner of his mouth twitched. He hadn't called me by name once. Only Admiral. Respect is a clean word when it's earned. It doesn't stick to your hands. The helicopter cut through a river of cloud and then into moonlight so clear it felt like a new sheet on an old bed. The captain handed me a folder anyway. Paper, the last honest technology. Inside a thumbnail photo of a hull, a diagram of compartments, 3 red circles where the math went bad. I traced the route with a finger and felt the old click in my chest, the fine lit snap when scattered things lock into thread. I thought of the anniversary room of Dad, at the microphone of pity, like rain that doesn't soak you unless you agree to stand still. Once I would have tried to fix the room before I left it. Explain, apologize for making anyone uncomfortable with the fact of who I'd become. Tonight, I adjusted my headset and let the room fix itself. The captain's voice cut back in. Ma'am, you'll have 2 hours on the jet. We'll patch in the ship's feed, but the secure uplink may lag. I've done more with less, I said. Copy, ma'am. He hesitated, then decided. For what it's worth, the room looked wrong down there. I knew which room he meant. It'll look different when we land, I said. The crew chief flashed a thumbs up. We dropped toward the airfield, toward a jet that would carry us to a table where the light stays on too late. I closed my eyes and saw nothing for the first time all night. This, too, is a kind of grace. You want me to start with the anniversary, with the helicopter, with the line that split a room and stitched me back together. Fair. It's the freshest wound, the newest proof. But no one gets summoned out of a party unless there were 100 smaller departures before it tiny leavings from rooms where the air wasn't built for you. If you really want to understand why a SEAL captain walked past my father and asked for me, you have to go back. To a stadium. To a glass case full of medals I wasn't allowed to touch. To a girl told to iron uniforms that weren't meant for her shoulders. To a house where dinner was at 1800 and tenderness had to report to duty. The jet door yawed like a mouth that knew my name. We climbed. The captain secured the latch. I settled into leather that was supposed to prove success to people who needed proof. The pilot's voice eased into our headsets. DC in 90. Smooth skies. I almost laughed. Smooth skies don't make sailors. but they do make space for stories. So I'll tell you mine. How a daughter becomes an admiral under a father who never learned to salute what he didn't build. How pity turns its head when the rotors start. How the room changes when you don't. Dad believed in neat edges on lawns, on shirts, on children. He measured Saturdays by how straight the mower lines ran, and Sundays by how quiet the living room stayed during 60 minutes. He called it order. I learned early that order was something you could fail, like a test you didn't know you were taking. Our house smelled like lemon pledge and starch. His boots lived beneath the coat tree at a 45-degree angle that might as well have been a rule. The mounted shadow box in his study held a bronze star and a purple heart in perfect alignment, and you didn't breathe too close to the glass. He called the display the altar with a half smile that dared you to laugh. I never did. When I was 10, he took me to the Army-Navy game in Philadelphia. It was December cold, the kind that bit the insides of your nose and made the hot chocolate taste like medicine. We sat high enough to see both cadets and midshipmen march in with that ceremonial seriousness grown men earn by surviving boys' dreams. The band hammered the air with brass. People around us shouted fight songs they'd learned before they knew their spouses' middle names. Dad didn't shout. He narrowed his eyes like he was reading the field for weak points. You see that he said, nodding toward the Navy side, the wave of white covers turning as one. Discipline. Tradition. That's what builds men. He emphasized the last word like it was the point and I'd missed it. I could do that, I said, because 10 is an age made of declarations. He didn't look at me. Leave the uniform to men who can handle it. Then he handed me his gloves because my fingers were going red. Care looked like correction in our house. Mom was the soft place. She taught American Lit and wore cardigans that announced seasons. Burnt orange leaves in fall pale lilac when the backyard tulips returned. She stored kindness in small rituals, cocoa warmed in the Dutch oven spare dollar bills, tucked into my coat for the book fair. When Dad's rules made the air too tight, she loosened it with stories. Stormbird she'd call me from Dickinson, from her own invention I never knew. Wild, fierce, just a little too strong for your own good. She meant it as a blessing, not an indictment. The word sat warm in my ribs. Even blessings had to pass inspection. At dinner, forks landed softly on china at 1800. Elbows were tactical errors. Feelings were best filed for later. If I scraped my knee on the driveway, Dad tossed me an antiseptic wipe and said, "Soldiers don't whine." I wasn't a soldier. He knew that. I knew that. But I learned to fold the pain small and put it in a pocket. Later, I'd pull it out and iron it flat with everything else. By middle school, I could press a dress shirt to regulation crispness and shine black shoes to a moon. I memorized the creases on Dad's dress screens and the names of medals I wasn't allowed to touch. When he traveled for reserve drills or association meetings, I would stand in the doorway of his study and study the altar like it might blink. I wasn't hungry for the medal. I was hungry for the story it told about worth. 8th grade brought the first career day. The guidance counselor lined up parents with clipboards, a dental hygienist, a guy who sold insurance, the manager of the feed store. Dad signed up late and strode in wearing his old Class A jacket, the fabric tight across a chest time refused to admit had changed. He delivered a lecture about duty and national character. Boys sat straighter. Girls scribbled. I asked one question he didn't answer. They're only at dinner. If I wanted to serve, would you help me figure it out? He chewed, put his fork down carefully, and said, "That's not how we build families." He didn't mean we. He meant I. So I made my own study plan. I found videos of Annapolis parades and learned what plebe summer meant. I did push-ups on my bedroom carpet, soft counting over the hum of the box fan. I ran laps around the block at dawn before the school bus, the sky pale as notebook paper. Mom, who hated secrets, kept this one. My shoes tucked by the back door, the towel left to dry on the porch rail. Sometimes she'd meet me at the sink when I got back and say nothing, just pour water and touch my shoulder like punctuation. Dad's approval lived like a lighthouse on a coast that kept shifting away. He taught me to parallel park with battlefield intensity and critiqued my turns like they could get someone killed. When I made honor roll, he nodded once. When I made varsity cross country, he said, "Run like someone is chasing you," and then turned back to the news. The chase became its own fuel. The year I turned 16, I asked to iron his dress uniform for a reunion dinner. He watched me from the doorway of the laundry room, silence pressed into the lint. When I finished, he ran a hand down the sleeve and gave the smallest lift of his chin. It was almost a salute. It lasted less than a breath, but I pocketed it like cash. 2 weeks later, I told him I wanted to apply to the Naval Academy Summer Seminar, the week-long intro that lets the curious learn the kind of tired their bodies haven't met yet. He didn't refuse. He left a manila folder on my bed applications for local colleges, nursing programs, a teaching certificate track. Realistic. He said, standing in the doorway with the hall light behind him like judgment. Service comes in lots of uniforms. The message was clear. Some uniforms didn't belong to me. That's when Mom started leaving me clippings, profiles of women officers, folded into my algebra book. An article about a female Marine drill instructor slipped under my cereal bowl. Just for context, she'd say, grinning like a conspirator who still baked pies for church. She drove me to the library 2 towns over, where the librarian kept back issues of Naval Institute proceedings and didn't mind a teenager reading them like scripture. You could be the calm in the room, Mom said once, when the house was quiet enough to tell the truth. You've got that kind of spine. I didn't know if spines were inherited or grown. I decided to pretend both could be true. Junior year, I sent for the Annapolis catalog. The envelope came thick and blue, the seal embossed like a dare. I took it to my room and ran my fingers over the pages the way other girls touched homecoming dresses. The photos glowed with a cleanliness that felt impossible. Ranks of white covers, hands sharp at brows, water glinting like promise. I filled out practice essays in the margins of my biology notebook and practiced saying, "Sir, ma'am," to the mirror when I didn't feel like either. I wore blisters into calluses on runs no one timed but me. Dad noticed the catalog and didn't comment. His silence had flavors. This was the cool kind, the Arctic front that replaced air with something thinner. On the night I asked him to write a recommendation, because sometimes even the wrong doors open. "If you knock with the right politeness," he said, "I won't help you fail at something you don't understand." I understood enough to write to my calculus teacher instead. The application itself was a campaign transcripts requested with the solemnity of ceasefires, medical exams, scheduled between meets a fitness test that made my lungs feel like new animal parts. I failed the first mile time and cried into my towel in the school locker room, the rubber mat smelling like defeat. Then I ran again that night in the kind of rain that erases your face and passed a week later by 2 seconds. 2 seconds can build a life. The interview panel sat 3 across in a municipal building that used to be a bank. An old Navy chief asked me what leadership was. I didn't quote a book. I told him it was remembering who needed the shade before the parade started. He smiled, the quiet kind that travels only in the eyes. "You'll do," he said afterward, shaking my hand like it held something stable. I waited for months with a calm I borrowed from somewhere I hadn't earned yet. Spring peeled the ice off the gutters. Track season started. Mom pressed a lilac postcard into my palm after school one day. Something came, and we stood on the front steps while I slit the envelope with a butter knife. The words were "pleased to offer." Jumped first, then United States Naval Academy, then appointment like a crown no one could see. I read it twice then, a third time for the sheer sound of it. Mom laughed and cried all at once, the way people do when a door finally opens that should have opened years ago. I walked into the kitchen where Dad was reading the paper like the news was a war that would surrender if he held his ground long enough. I held out the letter like a truce. He took it scanned, folded it back along the crease, and set it on the table. "So you're serious about this nonsense," he said. Then he stood, rinsed his coffee cup, and put it on the rack at an angle only he could measure. For 2 months, he didn't speak to me unless the subject was logistical. Car inspections, oil changes, the acceptable perimeter of a curfew. Silence built its own wall between us, brick by brick, efficient as habit. I ran longer. I lifted in the school weight room when the football boys weren't looking. I learned to hold the hurt like an egg you don't drop, not even when you sprint. On the night before I left for induction day, I ironed my white blouse on the same board where I'd ironed his dress greens. The fabric smelled like heat and beginning. Mom stood in the doorway with her cardigan sleeves pushed to her elbows, like she might wade in if the air got rough. "Let the wind harden you, not break you," she said. It sounded like a prayer and an order which in our house made it holy. Dad didn't come downstairs, but when I set the iron upright and unplugged it, I noticed something new on the altar's lower shelf, an empty space the size of a photo frame, cleared of dust. It meant nothing. It meant everything. I went to bed and dreamed of water that could carry weight. They shaved our heads at Annapolis. Not literally women kept our hair, but the metaphorical shearing was as clean. Identity went out with the trash on induction day. In came the shouting, the heat, the smell of sweat and starch, the blisters that taught you how much a body can blister before it quits. Some did quit. I didn't. Not because I was tougher, because I'd been practicing silence my whole life. When a detailer screamed an inch from my nose, it felt familiar. I'd grown up at parade rest in my own kitchen. Plebe summer was 7 weeks of learning you were always wrong. Step left when you should step right. Blink when you should stare. Speak when you should breathe. The only correct move was to move again faster, cleaner, without hesitation. I learned to square corners until my brain ran at right angles. I learned to hold a rifle until it felt like a limb I'd forgotten I was born with. Nights when the air buzzed with snores and suppressed sobs, I lay awake with calves throbbing, whispering Dickinson lines Mom had sewn into me. Storms aren't meant to stay grounded. She'd said that once when I cried over failing a pull-up test in high school. I said it now into the scratchy pillow. Let the wind harden you. By fall semester, I'd made it past the washouts. We lost one in my company to homesickness, so deep it looked like pneumonia. Another left after a knee collapse during log PT. The rest of us stayed stubborn as roots in stone. My grades held better than held. Calculus, chemistry, naval history. I liked the lines of ships, the math of water displacement, the poetry of angles that kept steel floating where it had no business floating. I liked the order that punished you only if you failed, not if you tried. Failure I could fix. Silence I could not. Dad didn't come to plebe parents' weekend. Mom did. She wore a cardigan the color of a robin's egg and hugged me until my ribs creaked. She sat through my explanations of chow calls and formation drills as if I were reading her poetry. "You've got your grandfather's walk," she said, meaning the man she'd loved, and Dad had feared disappointing. "Straight like you're carrying something worth not spilling." She brought me oatmeal cookies wrapped in wax paper. I hid them under my mattress and shared them only with the roommate who kept my secrets without asking. Dad sent nothing. Not a postcard, not a folded clipping. Nothing. Years stacked like ammo boxes. Sophomore year, I found myself on the parade field in a uniform that finally fit like skin. Junior year, I held rank over plebes who looked at me with the same wide eyes I'd once tried to hide. Senior year, I ran obstacle courses in rain so cold it cracked lips into blood smiles. Each milestone, I mailed home a photo. Not because I thought it would change him, because someday I wanted proof I hadn't imagined it. No reply ever came. Then came commissioning week. The stadium swelled with families. Anchors gleamed on white covers. I stood in a row of 100, waiting to throw mine high enough to scrape sky. When my name was called, my chest thrummed with the impossible weight of a commission pinned where skin met bone. Mom clapped until her palms went raw. Dad wasn't there. I knew it. Still, when the covers flew, I scanned the crowd for his jawline. Nothing. I called home that night, adrenaline still running hot. He answered on the third ring, silence heavy as static. "Dad?" I said, voice bright, because hope is stupid like that. "I did it. I'm an officer now." "You made your choice," he said. Then the line went dead. Orders came quick. My first assignment, Okinawa. Logistics not glamorous. Paperwork that told men twice my size where to stand, when to haul, how to keep supply lines unbroken. They expected me to falter. Some bet I wouldn't last a year. I lasted 5. I didn't bark. I observed. I fixed. When forms jammed systems, I learned the hinges and filed new ones. When someone rolled eyes at a female officer, I made sure the next briefing ran so tight they couldn't breathe between slides. I didn't need to shout. The work shouted for me. Then came 2007. A recon run off the Somali coast went bad. Supply team ambushed. 2 injured, 1 trapped. I wasn't required to deploy boots on ground, but I strapped mine anyway. Gunfire doesn't sound like movies. It sounds like teeth breaking in God's mouth. We crouched behind rusted containers, bullets chewing steel like paper. One of our boys bled out through a leg, shredded below the knee. I dragged him 40 yards under fire, cinched a tourniquet with one hand while the other clamped his femoral artery. By the time the medevac bird lifted, my uniform was soaked red and 2 shards of shrapnel lived in my side. I refused the stretcher. I can walk, I said, and walked. They called me Iceback after that. Said I bled ice, not blood. The nickname never sat right. I wasn't cold. I was hot with purpose. What mattered was the boy lived. Years later, he'd send me a Christmas card, a photo of his daughter. He'd named her Avery, after me. Recognition came slow, then sudden. Commendations, respect, more responsibility. Still, silence from home. When I mailed a photo of the Navy Distinguished Service Medal pinned to my chest, the envelope came back unopened. Return to sender scrawled across my handwriting. I stopped mailing, but the ache didn't stop. Absence is its own correspondence. By the time I hit Rear Admiral, even the old brass called me ma'am without irony. The men followed me into chaos because they trusted my calm. At Coronado, I rewrote training modules, dropped injury rates, raised resilience, saved more lives than medals could count. But still no phone call from Dad. Mom had been gone 3 years by then, breast cancer, quick and cruel. Her absence echoed louder than any applause. There was one night after we lost a promising instructor to suicide that I sat in my office stripping ribbons off my uniform one by one. They clattered onto the desk like loose teeth. I wept, not from weakness, but from weight. I made it policy after that mandatory monthly check-ins for every unit under my command. I couldn't bring him back, but I could keep others from slipping silent into nothing. Fast forward. Full Admiral. 4 stars. I received the message alone on a deck at sunrise. The sea stretched wide as forgiveness. No parade, no family, just sky and silence. A letter came days later in Dad's handwriting. They're just making you a symbol. 5 words sharp as shrapnel. I burned it in the sink. Then I ironed my whites. Because the next ceremony wasn't promotion, it was my wedding. James wasn't military. He didn't salute. He didn't line up his shoes at perfect angles or iron pleats into his pants until they could slice fingers. He was a civilian intelligence analyst, the kind who carried ideas instead of rifles. We met at a Department of Defense working group on cybersecurity. I thought his presentation format was sloppy. He thought mine was bureaucratic overkill. We argued in front of a dozen brass, and that night he rewrote the whole thing using my system. You were right, he told me the next morning, sliding a revised brief across the table with a half smile. That's how I knew. Not because he conceded, but because he listened. What struck me wasn't his brain, though it was quick and sharp, it was his steadiness. He didn't flinch when calls yanked me from dinner at 0200. He didn't complain when I couldn't talk about operations. He didn't treat my medals like exotic souvenirs. He looked at them, then at me, like they were just another part of the same story. You in uniform is the most honest thing I've ever seen, he said once. Why would I want you in anything else? So when he proposed, it was simple. No skywriters, no audience. Just us on a pier in Norfolk boots, dangling above black water that smelled of salt and diesel. He opened a small box. Let me serve beside you, he said, wherever that means. I didn't cry. I just said yes. Planning the wedding was harder than the deployments. James wanted quiet. I wanted honest. My team men I'd trained bled with buried brothers, beside wanted spectacle. We're not letting you walk alone, Chief Torres growled when I suggested a courthouse. So we settled on the Naval Chapel, formal, Sacred. Simple. I would wear my full dress whites. James would wear a navy blue suit. Not tuxedo pomp, just truth. A week before the ceremony, I sent Dad a card. Not hope, just completeness. I'm getting married this Saturday. 1,300 hours at the Naval Chapel. You're welcome to attend. I'll be in uniform. That was all. No RSVP came. The night before, James and I observed tradition's separate quarters. He stayed with a friend. I stayed on base ironing my uniform at midnight. 4 stars gleamed back at me from the brass. I'd worn them in combat, in grief, in command. Tomorrow, I'd wear them for love. My hands shook, not from nerves, but from the weight of what had been built alone and not alone. Morning broke clear, the kind of navy blue sky you only get on the Atlantic coast in spring. When I arrived at the chapel, I stopped short. A formation of SEALs stood outside, some I hadn't seen in years. Men who'd carried stretchers with me, who'd dragged me from wreckage, who'd buried friends at my side. No one had told them to come. They just did. Non-negotiable, one said, grinning through scars. You walked us through hell. We're walking you to something better. 15 minutes before the ceremony, I waited behind the heavy double doors flanked by Torres and Marcus Hill, 2 of my oldest team members, now fathers, hair silver at the temples. My heart wasn't racing. I'd faced mortars. I'd faced silence. This was different, but not harder. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket, a number I hadn't saved but could never forget. 5 words, you're wearing a uniform, disgraceful. No greeting, no blessing, just that. I stared at it for a full minute. Not anger, clarity. This was who he was, who he'd always been. Shame only works if you agree to it. I didn't anymore. I slipped the phone away and smoothed my cuffs. The organ swelled. The doors opened. Light fractured through stained glass, splashing reds and blues across the floor. I stepped forward. Heels struck polished wood in rhythm, sharp as rifle fire. The chapel filled with 200 decorated warriors. In one unified motion, they rose to their feet. Admiral on deck, someone shouted. The echo bounced like thunder in holy air. I hadn't expected tears, but my throat tightened. Not from sadness, from belonging. Dad wasn't there, but my family was. They saluted, not my title, not the rank stitched on fabric. They saluted the life, the grit, the blood, the years. James stood at the altar, eyes shimmering, hands folded at ease the way he knew I preferred. Behind him, the chaplain I'd served with overseas held a binder, but waited, reverent. The silence wasn't empty, it was full, thick with respect. We exchanged vows, stripped of ornament. No for richer or poorer. We said, when orders come, we follow together. When they don't, we find purpose anyway. He promised never to ask me to dim. I promised to let him stand where I'd once stood alone. The chaplain pronounced us husband and wife. No eruption, just reverence. Then applause, thunderous and clean. Outside, we walked under an arch of crossed sabers held by enlisted men. It meant more that way. They knew. At the reception, one of my SEALs, big guy, tattooed arms, voice like gravel, approached. We never stood for you because of your rank, ma'am, he said. We stood because you never made us feel small. Then he hugged me, a battlefield brother's hug, crushing and real. I let myself accept it, not because I needed comfort, because I'd earned it. Near midnight, when the cake was cut and the crowd thinned, James found me outside watching the water. Did you hear from him? He asked gently. I nodded. What did he say I told him? He was quiet a long time. Then, do you believe it? I looked at my whites, the gold trim, the 4 stars, the respect in 200 pairs of eyes earlier that day. No, I said, I don't. Some reckonings happen in battle, some in silence, some at an altar. That night, mine happened in the space between pity and salute. I'd spent a lifetime chasing a lighthouse that refused to shine my way. At the chapel, I learned I didn't need it. I had built my own. The helicopter blades churned the night air into shrapnel. Back at the banquet hall, crystal chandeliers swayed and champagne sloshed in tall flutes. Dad's 40th anniversary had been meant as a testament to endurance, 40 years of marriage, 40 years of routines polished into ritual. He'd taken the microphone with that smug half-smile, scanning the room like a commander counting troops. Then he dropped it. "She's my greatest disappointment." People laughed nervously, eager to file it under joke, but their eyes betrayed them. Pity. Always pity. I sat at the far table in a navy blue dress spine, straight letting the words roll through me like static. I'd been trained to stand at attention in worse storms. But the pity cut. It always does. That's when the low thrum grew louder, rattling silverware-raising whispers. Guests drifted to the French doors just in time to see the helicopter's landing lights flood the manicured lawn. A navy bird, unmistakable. Dad's old army buddies frowned, recognizing the sound of someone else's legacy. The doors banged open, wind-blasting napkins into the air like surrender flags. A SEAL captain strode in boots, heavy on parquet eyes, scanning the room until they locked on me. He didn't hesitate. "Admiral," he said, voice crisp above the rotor wash, "the president requests your immediate presence." The silence after was surgical. Every eye swung back to me, pity reshaping itself into something else, wonder, confusion, a hunger to rewrite what they thought they knew. Dad's jaw slackened, the microphone still clutched in his hand. I stood slowly, letting the weight of the word Admiral settle into the room. I hadn't come here to prove anything, but proof had landed anyway. 2 minutes, I told the captain. "You've got one," he replied. I crossed the floor. The parquet gleamed underfoot, rented at extra cost because Dad had insisted Oak said something about stature. He stared at me now, lips pressed tight as if silence could smother the spectacle. Mom's hand touched his sleeve. Her eyes met mine with apology she couldn't voice. Outside, the helicopter's searchlights carved circles across the lawn. The captain handed me a headset. "Signal breach in the Atlantic. Unauthorized vessel. POTUS wants your eyes on it." His tone was professional, but his stance, square unyielding, spoke respect. Behind me, someone whispered "Admiral" again, like they'd misheard. I didn't turn. Dad did. His face tightened pale under chandelier glow. "You planned this," he muttered, half accusation, half disbelief. "I didn't call the helicopter," I said. "And I didn't write your speech." He looked away first. I kissed Mom's cheek, smelling lilac and powder. She squeezed my hand with surprising strength. Then I followed the captain across the lawn. My heels sank into manicured grass, each step pulling me further from a room I no longer owed. The crew chief hauled me aboard. The cabin swallowed me with harnesses, headsets, mission chatter. As the doors slammed, the banquet hall shrank to a golden box in the dark. The bird lifted. Through the porthole, I caught one last glimpse, guests huddled on the patio dresses, whipping in rotor wash. Dad frozen in the doorway, microphone dangling. For once, he wasn't giving orders. He was just watching. Inside, the captain spread a folder across his lap. A cargo ship's blueprint, red circles on compartments. A hijack signal. The kind of problem that unraveled into headlines if you weren't careful. "We rendezvous with a jet in 90. Situation room on standby." "Copy," I said, strapping in. The vibration shook through my bones. Familiar. Calming. The cabin light flickered across his face. He studied me a moment. "For what it's worth, ma'am," he said quietly. "The room back there, it looked wrong." I knew which room he meant. "It'll look different now," I said. Below the town shrank the church steeple, the football field, the diner, where I'd once learned to drink bitter coffee. Everything looked small from here. Perspective has a way of trimming old wounds down to size. The captain slid a photo across to me, a grainy satellite shot of the rogue vessel. I traced the marked path with my finger, the pieces clicking together. Years of training deployments, nights with red maps glowing in dark rooms. This was why the president needed me. Not because I was a daughter. Not because I was a disappointment. Because I'd earned it. I leaned back as the helicopter sliced through clouds, leaving pity and chandeliers behind. Somewhere below, Dad still clutched his microphone, unsure if the silence was his to command anymore. For once, the room wasn't his. It was mine. The jet waited on a dimly lit runway, its nose pointed east like a compass needle. We transferred fast rotors, still chopping air, as the crew chief hustled me across tarmac that smelled of kerosene and salt. Inside leather seats gleamed a tray of water bottles strapped down tight. The hum was steadier here, but the weight in the room heavier. The SEAL captain briefed me again mid-climb. Unauthorized signal, cargo ship, Atlantic coordinates, possible hostile infiltration. NSA flagged it, but POTUS wants your eyes. He didn't bother to hide respect in his tone. He knew why I'd been pulled out of a banquet and into this bird. Not because I was available, because I was necessary. I traced the schematics' red circles marking choke points. Years of command lived in my fingertips. Somali firefight Coronado, reforms deployments etched into scar tissue. None of it had been for applause, but it had led to this, a seat at the table where the president waited. 2 hours later, Washington glowed below grid lines of power, humming like circuitry. We landed at Andrews. A motorcade whisked us to the White House lights, flashing sirens cutting quiet streets. Inside, marble and history swallowed us whole. The Situation Room was already alive when I stepped in. Screens lit with maps, faces grim in blue glow. NSA SecDef Joint Chiefs. POTUS at the head of the table, jacket off-tie, loosened, but eyes sharp. He didn't rise. He didn't need to. The room straightened when he said, "Admiral, we need clarity." I gave it. Calm, direct. Explained the breach, the vessel's course, the dangers of letting it slip dark. Showed them where to intercept, how to contain without escalation. They listened, not because my voice was loud, but because it was steady, because it carried years of storms survived. When I finished, the president nodded once. "We'll proceed." His gaze lingered. "Good work. Again. Again. Not the first time, not the last." The mission spun forward. Orders relayed, assets mobilized. My part was done for now. I left the White House just as dawn brushed the horizon, painting the Potomac in thin gold. Exhaustion tugged, but beneath it a deeper calm. This was the life I had built step by step, mile by mile, a life no microphone joke could shrink. Back at the safe house, James was waiting. He didn't ask for details. He never did. He just handed me coffee, strong and black, and said, "You're back sooner than I thought." Then quieter. Saw the footage, the chopper, the captain. "You looked right." "Right?" I asked. "Like yourself," he said simply. Later, my cousin Claire sent a text, a photo attached, blurry, taken from across the banquet hall parking lot. In the corner, unmistakable posture, rigid arms crossed. My father. Watching the helicopter lift, not coming closer, not speaking, just watching. He hadn't saluted, not yet. I stared at the photo a long time. James looked over my shoulder, then said, "He came, but he still couldn't stand." I set the phone down. For once, it didn't slice me open. Maybe because I finally understood his silence wasn't my weight to carry anymore. Months passed. Operation succeeded, failed, blurred. Then a letter arrived, handwritten. No return address, but I knew the script. I didn't enter because I didn't know how to sit among people who saw in you what I refused to. I didn't salute, not because you didn't earn it, but because I no longer knew how to honor what I didn't understand. I was wrong. If you'll let me, I'd like to talk. No uniform, no protocol. Just a father trying to understand a daughter he never took the time to know. I read it 3 times. Didn't burn it, didn't cry, just sat with it. A week later, we met at Arlington at Mom's headstone. Grass-trimmed silence absolute. He wore civilian clothes smaller than I remembered. I arrived in uniform not to make a point, but because it was who I was. He looked at me and said, "You look like your mother when you stand like that." We talked, not medals, not war, grief, regret. How silence masquerades as strength but really hides fear. Before we parted, he straightened. Slowly raised his hand in a salute. Crooked, imperfect, but real. It landed heavier than any medal I'd ever pinned. I returned it, not because he'd earned forgiveness, but because he'd finally chosen truth. 1 year after the helicopter cut through the chandeliers, I found myself on a stage at the Pentagon floodlights, hot on my shoulders. The Department of Defense had chosen me to deliver the keynote for a leadership symposium. The brass wanted lessons in resilience and reform, in what it meant to command, when the rules bent under pressure. I didn't tell my story to shine my medals. I told theirs of sailors who followed me into fire, of SEALs who stood at my wedding because they trusted my voice more than tradition. I closed with one truth: respect isn't inherited. It isn't demanded. It's earned by showing up, by standing up, by doing right when no one's watching. The room stood, not because they had to, because they wanted to. When the applause settled, a courier pressed an envelope into my hand. Cream cardstock block letters on the front. My name. Inside my father's script. I watched your speech. I read your proposals. You built a life not to prove me wrong, but to save lives. I see that now. I hope I haven't missed my chance to stand beside you, even in a small way. Dad. Weeks later, I invited him to another address, this one to cadets at Annapolis. He sat in the back, quiet gray, not the colonel of my childhood, but just a man trying to unlearn old wars. Afterward, he approached cap in his hand. I'm proud of you, he said. Then softer. I'm sorry it took me so long. I nodded. Not because it fixed the years, but because it started something. That night, James asked, are you happy with how it turned out? I thought of the chapel of 200 warriors rising in unison. I thought of the banquet hall chandeliers trembling as a SEAL captain called me Admiral. I thought of Arlington, where a salute finally bridged silence. I'm satisfied, I said. Not because they suffered, because real change happened. The silence broke. Months later, at a training base I hadn't visited in years, I scanned the roster and saw a familiar name, Corporal Avery Patterson. The little girl named after me had grown into boots of her own. She shook my hand and said, my dad told me you saved him. I wanted to serve like that. That's legacy, not blood, choice. On the anniversary of my wedding, I stood again in uniform, this time accepting the Department of Defense's Excellence in Ethical Command Award. James was in the front row, and in the far corner, my father rose with everyone else. He saluted, this time steady. I realized then, revenge isn't always about breaking what broke you. Sometimes the most powerful reckoning is recognition. Sometimes justice is building what they said you couldn't, standing tall until they have to look up. So if you're listening, ask yourself, who stood for you when others didn't? When did you turn humiliation into strength? Leave a comment, share your story. And if you want more truths, more reckonings, more quiet victories, subscribe. We rise together.